everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Spincast. Today, we have Landon DUMAR with us. He is one of the founders of RPM Athletics out of the Boston area. He does a lot of great work in general wellness and health, specifically on the mental side of things. And today, we're going to talk about how we can apply some of those archetypes into esports to help you better understand your mental state and wellness while you're gaming and pursuing your passions. So, Landon, go ahead, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what sparked your interest in wellness and health, and then how you're trying to apply that into esports as well.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Landon DUMAR. I'm the Director of Integration at RPM Athlete Performance, and my role is focused around how do we holistically help athletes and performers of all types, which includes esports gamers, to understand their performance within 5 pillars of performance: mind, body, nutrition, skill, and recovery. So skill being your esports related technical, tactical, micro, mechanical skills. Body being sort of your fitness, health, how you take care of your body. Recovery being sleep, being how self-care, right? How your habits around that. And then nutrition, what you eat. And then the last piece being the mind, which is a lot of my professional background and where I initially started within RPM, being sort of how do you help yourself to optimally learn, optimally prepare for performance, optimally train, and optimally live, right? And having a life worth living fully. And that, to me, I believe performance is an opportunity to learn how to live our best lives. That the pressures of challenge and obstacles that come up teach us lessons about life in general. And so my interest around health and wellness has been longstanding. I played sports all through my youth and then quit soccer my senior year in high school because I wasn't able to access my true potential, essentially. And it took a few years before I found my way back to sports and found MMA and jiu-jitsu, and have competed and trained in that for over 10 years. And initially had a lot of really early success, and then found myself struggling with the same types of mental blocks that I had when I was younger. And through my training and through my own research and reading books and really just diving deep, I started to recognize the importance of the mental side of performing. And that led me to my undergrad degree focused around psychology, holistic psychology, mindfulness, counseling, and then led and eventually to getting my master's degree in athletic counseling and also adding a clinical mental health counseling component as well. And through that process, also really recognizing that you can't just focus on the mind. Like it's all interconnected, the body, the mind, that looking at living intentionally in every aspect of my life, how I eat, how I slept, looking at all my habits, looking at all of those things to help me not only perform my best, but also for me, sports was what brought so much meaning and significance into my life and performing. And my interest in esports emerged as I was getting my master's degree, and having played video games all through my youth, I played, I remember Halo and doing LAN tournaments and like playing with buddies and hooking up our Xboxes, and SOCOM 2. SOCOM 2 was my game back in the day on PS2, and being one of those early like true online games, and then moved away from video games for a long time, but seeing how that community had grown and thrived since that, and quickly then being so focused on the mental side, seeing the unique opportunities within esports to share all of the lessons I had learned and to work with individuals on understanding how much mental performance is a major factor in competition or just playing in esports and video games in general. And certain aspects like tilt, that even just having it in the language is so much different, that there's no traditional sports that has a word to conceptualize and understand that our emotions impact our performance. And I can teach that to athletes, and they understand it on a certain level, but they aren't really thinking about it in the same way that esports gamers are. And so I was immediately drawn to that and the unique performance aspects and challenges that esports provides, of being able to be able to compete all day long if you want, right? Like, I can compete 24 hours a day if I want, which is also very different. And so there's so many unique components to esports that just fascinate me to work in an exciting and emerging area. And to want to see where, I'm just so interested to see where it goes, and to be a part of that process and to share where I can add value, because I think it has so much potential to be a really strong foundation for people approached in the right way, in the same way I said, like, using performance as an opportunity to grow as a person. Like, I think esports can really serve that. It provides a lot of unique challenges, but those also provide you a really strong opportunity to develop skills that others might not.
Yeah, for sure. I think that was an excellent introduction, to say the least. Kind of showing yourself as, at bare minimum, an expert in this mental health, wellness, and general health field, for sure. So a couple of things I want to unpack there and ask you a little more in depth about. You said tilt a lot. Now, from personal experience, I've definitely been tilted before, and it is unique that gamers have a very unique way of portraying their negative emotions, right? And in looking at tilt, there's so many ways that we could dissect that and have an entire podcast episode on that. But one thing in particular that really stands out to me, as esports is growing so much, is in LAN competitions, and in in-person competitions, not in online formats. People get tilted in different ways when they're out of their comfort zone, right? So typically, a lot of gamers play online at their home, in their room, or study, whatever it may be, and then they go and compete for the high dollars and high stakes competitions, and they kind of lose themselves. They get tilted really easily. You can see it in their expressions, their face, their communications with their teammates. So what are some of your thoughts on there, and more specifically, like, how could those players start to address at home, so they're better prepared as esports continues to expand to more LAN tournaments rather than online tournaments?
Yeah. Well, there's a common metaphor I use to describe most people's approach to um, working on the difficulties that emerge from a sort of a competition, a performance, like a really, and what's beautiful about sports is that and what makes it unique in sports, or esports, like, that it's encapsulated. The performance is contained, right? There's a before, there's a during, there's an after. Unlike anything else really in our life, doesn't have that much structure, and there's a winner and a loser, right? We have objective measures. And so this provides us a lot of helpful opportunity to work on ourselves, because there's a container. There's something to, it's so much hard. Life is so complex. It's so spread out that it can be hard without that container. So the metaphor, so most people approach the metaphor I use is this idea of thinking, if you imagine right now that there's a 2x4 on the ground, and I say, okay, I want you to walk down the 2x4, balance on it, don't fall off, just keep walking back and forth and do this, right? And you can do that. Almost anyone would probably be able to do this pretty easily, and you'd be like, all right, I can do this, great. Like, this isn't too hard. Like, yeah, almost fell off there, but I'm good. I say, okay, great. Like, clearly this is not that challenging. And then I take that 2x4 and I put it on top of 2 ladders. And then I say to you, all right, go do it now. And you're like, hold on a second. It's like, what? You just did it like 10 times in a row without any issue. What's changed? Like, what's hard about this? And what's changed is that there's a risk there. there's a real risk, right? I'm going to fall and get hurt is the idea. And what happens in those LAN tournaments or any time we're competing and performing, especially when there's people paying attention to us, there's some type of something that an elevated sense of performance, right? In that same way, like this elevation, there's a perceived risk. I'm going to look bad. People are going to think I'm stupid. I'm not good. I'm going to let my teammates down. I'm going to all of these things, right? Like they're going to think I'm not good at this game if I don't do this, or I won the last tournament and now everyone expects this of me, right? All of these stories that come up in the stories our mind tells us about this are what really create a lot of that difficulty. And then there's these difficult emotions that come along with that. And so most people's approach is like to go back to the 2x4 on the floor and just like, oh yeah, just go do more of that. Like you'll be more confident. Just keep doing what you're doing. That'll build your confidence, right? It's like, just practice more and then you'll be more confident. But the reality is that that can have some impact and value over time, potentially, but it's more about understanding and recognizing how can I help myself prepare for performing in a different scenario when there's different conditions. There's different types of preparation sort of required there. We have this sense of like, there's something different here. And so how do I help start working on this? And it's not to just go back to your technical skills and try to keep refining those, right? It's not like it can be, you can try it. You're welcome to try it. Most people do. And most people also find to a certain point that there's diminishing returns the deeper you go, as opposed to looking at how do I relate and respond to when nervousness or anxiety or worry or frustration or disappointment or overconfidence or burnout or all these things that we know are coming up as prevalent within esports. And those LAN ones are probably something around anxiety, nervousness, those pieces that come up usually when we think about tilt. And this is an important piece as well with tilt, that we expand this definition to, number one, I don't use the language of positive and negative emotions because all emotions have value in certain contexts. Fear has emotion value. Fear has value when we're in a dangerous situation because it helps us be more alert. Grief has value when something really sad has happened. We've lost someone close to us to feel that emotion. Frustration, all of these, every emotion has value in a certain context. And so it's more looking at, is the emotion helpful or unhelpful, depending on what's happening? And then also, how am I relating to that emotion? So we can get, what happens is when sometimes we get nervous or anxious in those performance scenarios, we have a story around what's going to happen. Ooh, like number one, we're a story might influence us to have those emotions of, oh, I'm worried about looking bad, right? We talked about that. And then there's the story about what the emotion might do to us. Oh, I'm feeling nervous. Oh, I'm not going to play my best. Oh, like this is, right? It starts to wind and spin and we go bigger, 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 bigger. And we go off into like, we get pulled into the future. We're living in the future. We're not here in the present and what's happening right now. And that's where we will perform our best, when we're totally focused, we're in the moment, right? As most of us have experienced when playing video games, when we're just really deeply centered in the moment. And as I know, you'll sort of want to touch on flow a little bit, when we're fully present, there's an effortlessness to this at times, certainly when we enter into this state, but we're deeply focused on the immediate now. And so looking at what are the stories that we have around nervousness, anxiousness, those feelings, to examine how we're responding to those when they show up. Because we can influence our emotions a little bit at times, but it's also when we try to control them too much, they actually can just get bigger, right? The more we try to like squeeze it and like change it and fight it, the more oftentimes it just makes it potentially worse. And so there's this idea of the difference between pain and suffering. So another metaphor, if I put my hand on the hot stove, right, I experience pain. And so this could be sort of the nervousness or the anxiety, right? I don't like this feeling. Ow, that really hurt. The
Mhm.
suffering is what we do to ourselves after that. Oh, you're such an idiot. Why did you do that? Right? Like all of those extra pieces where I
Mhm.
beat myself up. And with nervous and anxiety, we might beat ourselves up, but it might just all be those other pieces that we add to the sensation of nervousness, the feeling of nervousness in our body, the butterfly sensation, and then having that emotion present that actually makes it bigger. We're feeding it in some way, right?
Mhm.
We're yeah, we're giving it power over us.
Mhm.
And these are patterns that are ingrained in us too. And so it's not intentional really. This is why it's a skill, right? This is why practicing that ladder on top of like thinking about these scenarios where the 2x4 is on top of the ladders is about practicing our relationship with our emotions if we want things to change. And what we've developed was helpful potentially to us at some point in our life. The way that we responded to nervousness and having that sort of influence us in certain ways to maybe not do something, or right, like anxiety and nervous
Mhm.
is helpful to be like, oh, should I do this? I don't know. Like
Mhm.
that can be helpful, but we're trying to do something that's really important to us, and so
Mhm.
we want to have a different relationship with our emotion in that scenario. And so that's going to take practice to retrain ourselves, to retrain, to create new pathways in our brain, um, so that we can perform the way that we want to perform, and we can allow those feelings to still be present. It's okay. I can be nervous and anxious and still perform the way that I want to perform. Can we find a way to develop that relationship? I'm going to pause there.
No, you're good. You're good. There, yeah. I think that's a really great elaborate answer there. And there's a few things I want to comment on real fast before we go on to flow, which is another thing I want to touch on. Is that feeding those emotions? I know that's something really prevalent. In my experience, I played competitive Siege for about 2.5 years, and I probably played with 30 different teammates, and almost all of them, they only focused on what they did wrong, right? And I'd sit down or try to talk it through them, and I did the same thing. It's like, oh, I did this wrong, I did this wrong, I did this wrong. It's like, what about the 50 things that you did right? What about the round that you won because you did a 1v2 clutch, or you used your utility perfectly, or you made a really good call or did something that was specific to your role, and focus on the positive and then go back and fix the negative, right? But too much, I feel like that's definitely a very prevalent issue, is that they just focus on what's wrong and they feed those negative energies instead of actually striving to fix it. And then kind of also going off of that into flow. I'd say the flow where, like you said, like you're in the game is kind of the expression that always pops up in my head, is that
Mhm.
you're only focused on right now and winning. You're not really focused on any emotions really. You're kind of just in that neutral state where you're just so focused that everything's coming naturally. You're not overthinking, you're not dwelling on anything, you're not looking towards the future. You're just playing to your full potential. So I want to kind of talk about how we can enhance that flow and keep it a little more consistent, because I think a lot of gamers get in flow really easily, but then they diminish that flow because they're kind of like always gaming
Mm.
rather than learning like when to peak and when to play at their potential, um, like in that complete flow state, if that makes sense. So kind of just touch on some of those ideas, and expand how we can help those states be more prevalent, in that best way possible.
Yeah, and so I think I can transition your comment right into flow and your question
Hmm.
as well. And so, yeah, to me, what I love about tilt is the essence of tilt is essentially being off balance.
Hmm.
And that's really what we're describing, right? It's not about being angry or rage or any particular emotion or really it doesn't even need to be feelings focused. It's we're off kilter, right? We're tilted. And so it's more about, can we think about what being untilted, or better yet, balanced, right? It's about finding balance. And the only person in all of the work that I do with athletes or teams or whoever it is, gamers, is what does balance look like for you? That's real, and I can't answer that. Only you can answer what balance is. So I don't have the answers. We can look at experts, and we can use external resources, but really diving deep into the question for yourself as a performer, what does balance look like for me in all of these different ways? So as you highlighted, right, focusing too much on what you did wrong, or the mistakes you made, or the opportunities to get better, can be a hindrance, and that can get out of balance. But also you don't want, like, you want some of that, right? Like you can't only focus on what you did well, because that's not helpful either. So it's
Exactly.
finding this balance between them. And are you constantly looking and open to what's my balance point? And so this really leads into flow. And flow is this state of optimal performance where we feel our best and perform our best. And this state is important, because it's like sleep. We can't force it. So I talk about like sleep hygiene, flow hygiene. How are you setting the conditions for flow to occur? And a lot of it just simply comes down to that balance, because if we the beautiful thing about flow is it feels amazing. We get all of these, neurochemical releases of endorphins and adrenaline and like all this stuff that's like amazing, and it's basically like a natural drug in a lot of ways. And that also has a challenge, because then we can tend to potentially try to strive after that and say, "Ooh, I want that again. Ooh, give me that again." And that's the aspect of, as maybe we've all experienced, I'll speak for myself, where I'm just like, I want to just play video games all the time. And I notice the more consecutive time I play, the more diminishing returns I sort of get in enjoyment. As I get more mentally fatigued, physically fatigued, and there's just like, it just leads more and more down just being drained, and getting, for me, the frustration comes up, and all of those things. So it's how can we, so to me, to your question was, how can we better improve towards flow? What we know about flow, and there's another concept, deliberate practice, which is comes from the work of Anders Ericsson on expertise. He looked at experts in all of these different disciplines. One of them majorly was chess. So, I think there's some strong correlations there too that we can make to esports. And the things that trigger flow are actually very similar to the characteristics of deliberate practice. And I think one of the mistakes that happens in esports is this just like grind mentality of, can we be, so the deliberate practice is counteracted with naive practice, that you're being habitual, you're just going through the motions effectively. And so if you don't really have a clear intention going into a competition scenario or even a practice scenario, and you don't have a clear sort of reflection process after, where we're trying to take something away, then the likelihood is that we're not performing our best, and that we may still get into flow, and we may have a great experience, but we may not be helping ourselves to get the most better. And and also flow might be more elusive in that capacity. And so there's no, if it was a light switch, everybody would just turn it on. Like, it's still elusive to many of us, and it's just a very personal process, just like sleep too, right? Sleep hygiene, we can look at, get 8 hours of sleep and, do your blackout shades and all of those things, but also everyone has their own process. So it's really engaging in that self-discovery and not holding it too tightly, because if we try to force it, we try to make it happen, just like sleep, it's going to be elusive to us. So we want to like sneak up on it kind of. And that I think the biggest thing I see in difference between esports and regular athletes is the regular athletes don't have the ability to compete all the time. They can't just compete on demand. And that forces them to elevate those competition times a lot more. And in some ways, you can see how those land scenarios, because you're able to compete all the time at home, there isn't maybe as much feeling of elevation when you compete. And that, so back to this land scenario, as one example, since we've worked with that, can we be much more intentional when we're intentional with everything, but intentional when we're choosing to compete, And actually, if we don't have external demands set on us, right? The traditional athletes have these external conditions, right? They literally can't choose to compete in the same way if they want to. But we can impose our own sort of constraints on ourselves with our training, when we practice, how we practice, when we perform. It's just more onus is on the gamer themselves to be really intentional with all of those pieces. And the more intentional you can be with every piece, I think the better that'll be served, because you'll gain an understanding over time of what works best for you. That's the only way, is to like be intentional with every piece. If you're just going through the motions, then you're not being, like, by very nature, you're not being intentional, and you're not really going to know what works best for you, because you're just doing the way the game was constructed. And these games are constructed to have us want to play more. Just like, oh yeah, just hop in another game, just load in. Like, they're designed for a particular outcome. It's not bad or good, but it's recognizing that, because the games are optimized to have us play as much as possible, not get as good as possible at the game.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that couldn't have been more well put. And something that I always just harp on, a lot simpler, is just quality over quantity. Taking that first step, like obviously what we just talked about are those next, 3 or 4 or 5 steps down the line. But starting at quality over quantity and looking at, like you said, have that intention to get better at some kind of aspect of the game, whether that's playing a particular character or a particular map or a particular phase of the game, especially for longer, more drawn-out games like League of Legends or multi-round competitions like CS:GO or Siege has. Looking at something intentional to improve at, with those practice sessions or those game sessions. Unfortunately, that is kind of all the time we have left. I do have one last quick question for you, Landon, before we have to stop. Some quick advice. So just 1 or 2 quick things that you think that, especially for younger gamers that have these passions but aren't quite sure how to approach them in that positive, constructive way. Some just quick tidbits or points that can help, start to spur a good foundation in looking towards the future for these younger athletes with all these great passions.
Yeah. How do we make this tangible, right? This is very esoteric and hard to know how to get started on as compared with some other areas. I think 2 practices come to mind, one of which is journaling. Just what if you start writing down things about, you want to get better at a game? What if you just start writing things down? Maybe before, what you're maybe you can what what are you going to do before the game, reflections after the game. There's really, you can do whatever you want with it, but if you want to be more intentional, taking and pausing and making time to just write down things is inherently going to encourage that behavior in some ways, right? And so there's a million different ways to approach it, but I think just the act of this, and the research supports this, of like, there's research on nutrition. If you just have people pay attention to what they eat, without any other interventions, just pay attention, write it down, that people actually start making healthier food choices as a result of that. And so in the same way, I believe that if you start writing down and paying attention to more of your games and reflecting in that way, that you'll gain more awareness. Because for me, the first step is always awareness. And then this other piece would be just meditating. And what is meditating? Just, you can do it as simply as set a timer on your phone for 5, 10, or 15 minutes and sit and be with what it's like to be in your internal experience, right? When we talked about that 2x4 on top of the ladder, the major difference is just internal. It's all perception. It's all about how I'm perceiving, because it's the same act. I have all of the skills to do that. It's the way I'm perceiving and relating to that situation. So what would it be like if you just closed your eyes and sat quietly and still and noticed what happened? Have how much have we actually spent in our lives and been encouraged to pay attention to what goes on in here, and not as much necessarily in the thinking and analyzing brain, but the just being with our experience. And so I don't want to, there's a million different ways to approach that. Headspace, if you want something structured as a resource, Headspace is really excellent and has a lot of performance based guided meditations, but you don't need it. Like, you can explore this process on your own. What is it like to just be with yourself? And there's lots of journals and things like that you can find. But it's really can be as simple as just starting on that process. Is it going to show necessarily immediate results? Not maybe, but maybe not, just like anything. But I'd be curious what would happen if individuals just started to play in that way and just started to understand themselves better, understand their performance, and understand them in terms of what goes on internally, as opposed to just focusing on what I see in so much in esports is just so much technical, tactical, mechanical focus that is really important and valuable. And I'm not discounting that, but back to this balance thing. Are we overweighting, the amount of focus we give to those components, that there's diminishing gains that if we actually focused on some other areas that could have a lot more, it could have really big impact. And then as we reach the next level of our development and competition, then we go back to the technical and tactical when it feels like, you know what, I need this. And that's coming back to that intuitive sense of balance of realizing, you know what, like, there isn't necessarily more juice to squeeze right now on that on the mechanics or the aspects of the game, and where else can I look in my life that I can work on? My sleep, the way I eat, or this mental aspect as well.
Yeah. Excellent answer right there. Some real quick comments before we finish up. I think that balanced kind of perspective and approach is something that's so readily seen in those high-level athletes in traditional sports. I mean,
Yeah.
look at someone that pops into my mind. I'm a big fan of Ronaldo, right? When you talk to Ronaldo, he focuses just as much outside of the game: sleep, nutrition, working out, training, his mental health, just as much as his, shooting technique and his fitness
Yeah.
in game and his, all those dribbling skills and mechanical stuff. Having that balance and realizing when certain things are more important. I'm sure right now he's training a whole lot more than he used to be, just because of the state of the world. But realizing when that balance might shift one way or the other and addressing it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's excellent. Real quick, Landon, tell us where we can find out a little bit more if we're interested. A website, Twitter, anything that we can keep up to date with your work, and then we'll wrap up from there.
Yeah. You can go find more at rpmathlete.com. Is our website, and we have a new program, Project Shadow, which is for elite performers focused around this holistic and integrated development. It's application only, and we're accepting applications right now. I'm also on Facebook. I have a Facebook page. I'm still working on my social media game outside of that, but those are, and my email is on the RPM website as well if you want to reach out to me, and I'm always happy to answer people's questions, interact. I love just connecting with the community. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's one of the best things about esports community is that almost everybody involved wants to just sit down and talk and learn more about what someone else, their questions, helping them, or just learning more about the other person. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. Everyone, thank you for listening. Another great episode with a lot of great content, and hopefully soon we can expand even more on these ideas, as that wellness and balance. Those are very general words, but like I said previously, we could spend probably 2 or 3 days talking about this, just to start. So thank you, everybody out there in these really unprecedented times. Stay healthy, stay happy, and stay plugged in.